Okay, welcome to this second edition where we are doing some shading within objects and also some subtle drop shadows. So the first thing we always do is we go to Window and make sure that we are in Workspace, Essentials Classic, and then also go to Workspace, Reset Essentials Classic. And then from here, we're going to take the Layers icon and drag it over into this right panel so you can see our layers here. And you can notice within the layers we have our labels, we've got the ball fill color, we've got the shadows, and then we've got the background. Okay, so let's first talk about this first one here. So one of the ways you could give a sense of dimension is by adding a gradient to a fill here. So here's the normal fill. If we select on this object and you look over in the fill on the left side here, you can see that it has a gradient in it. So let's go ahead and work on that. Now, I want to first point out that it's really important to figure out your colors, okay? And let me show you why. So let's go ahead and select this element, hit the I for the dropper tool, okay? And we're going to select that. So that's the normal fill. And then if we're going to fill this with a gradient, we select on the element, and then over on the right we have this gradient tool here. And then you can see that by default it picks the fill color and then it sort of darkens it down to black. Not too bad, but we're going to fix that a little bit later. So if we double click on the swatch here, now you see you get this gradient. But we want a more subtle gradient, right? We don't want that. We don't want it to go from the blue all the way to black. We want it to go from the blue to something a little bit more natural. So first we're going to pick out our colors. So we know that this first color here, this lighter blue, and then we want to get a slightly darker version of that. So we can go ahead and select this. I'm going to grab the eye tool and we're going to fill that with the main color. And then we got to figure out what is our shadow color. So I'm going to select this little rectangle swatch here too, and then also use the dropper tool or click I and click on that. Now when I click on this here, I'm going to double click and sort of darken this down a little bit, right? And so now instead of having a gradient that goes from the light blue to black, we're going to go from light blue to more of this like darkish blue that has the same basic hue. So now let's select here, okay? And we know that this one's already good. And just so you know, if you go to this area here, this is the hexadecimal color. You can always copy this and drag and copy that into another swatch. Let me show you that. So if I select this, I'm going to go here, copy this. Now I could drop this also into the darker color by selecting the darker color and pasting it. And then if you click away, it's going to give you the same fill, right? Both of the sides of that gradient have the same fill color. However, we don't want that black. We want kind of this other blue here, this darker blue. So I'm going to, with the right side selected, I'm going to grab the color picker, and then I'm going to go over here and select this darker one, okay? And actually I'm just going to grab this little slightly darker one here too. Alright, so that's a lot better. It's more of a natural gradient. So now we want to change the gradient to a radial gradient. So we click over here on radial gradient, and then as we click over here, you can modify this gradient by using the gradient tool over in the left toolbar. So let me grab on this, and notice as soon as I click that gradient tool, you get this new tool here, and there's some pretty cool things you can do. You can grab the far handle and kind of increase the scale of the gradient, so that's going to help a little bit. You can also squeeze the gradient down, so I'm grabbing the top handle and kind of squeezing it down. And then of course you can also change the center point of where that gradient is, okay? So I'm going to undo this and I'm going to grab actually I'm just going to grab the whole thing physically and kind of bring it over here, right? Because we know that we want it to have kind of a highlight in the top right, and we're going to drag this out, okay? Now it can be a little bit tricky, okay, to get the feeling of this. And right now it feels like there's not enough of the normal fill color. There's kind of too long of a gradient. So there's some ways that you could do that. You could either adjust it here by pulling one element one direction, and you notice that this has the same effect, right? So we kind of want most of the object to be filled we kind of want most of the object to be filled with that normal blue fill, and then only a little bit of it at the bottoms here. Now I could also kind of stretch this out even more, and you can play around with that, right? So I would say just play around with it until you feel like you get that pretty close. Okay, I think I might have made it a little too big here. So something like that, I think. Let's see if we can get this a little bit. Okay, so you can play around with that. So anyway, all right, so we get that kind of feeling of shading right there within the object using that gradient fill. Now let's talk about this shadow here. Now this shadow is kind of interesting because before we just grabbed the ellipse tool and we had a kind of like a medium gray. Let's cancel that. I'm going to Command D to deselect. We had kind of like a medium gray, right? That's what we were doing in the previous thing. So we had this medium gray. But there are some other ways that you can kind of create this shadow that has a nice dark saturated center and then kind of fades off. So again, we're going to play around with the gradient. So what I'm going to do first here is double click on the gradient to give that gradient in the center here for this shadow. And then, you know, noticing again that by default it adds that black to the right side here. So actually I'm going to double click on this and change this to white by hitting the white swatch. And so now we get sort of like this oval, but it has this gradient in it. Now once again we're going to go to the radial gradient and change that gradient. Okay. One thing we can notice here though is that the gradient is kind of like a perfect circle in here rather than going in the oval, and that's again a function of the way that the default gradient gets placed. Alright, so let's go to our gradient tool and we're going to kind of squeeze this down and kind of get it more to the oval shape, right? And then again we can play around with where the starting point and the finishing point of our gradient is. Okay, so now you see that I've got an oval shape here and it's got a gradient on it, a radial gradient, and that gradient is going from gray to white, and then also the actual shape of the gradient is kind of squeezed down to make it fit that oval. Okay, so how do we get it to look like this? Well, first step we're going to do is we're going to select this, okay, and we're going to go to blending mode, color burn. Now let me show you this. So we're going to click on the opacity here and we're going to change the blending mode to color burn. In the previous one we had done multiply, but let me show you what happens with multiply because it's a little bit weird. If we click on this and we go to multiply, it's okay, but you can kind of see the sharper edges here, or if we kind of zoom in, it's a little too sharp on the edge here. So in this particular case, because you're going from gray to white, it's going to look better if you do color burn. Alright, now the other thing we could do is, you know, say we wanted to get darker or lighter, we can always change the you know, this element here and make it darker. So let's see, I'm going to make this using my little swatches and make that a little bit darker. Maybe that's too dark. Let's go for dark. Okay. Now if I delete the previous one, notice how that previous one is a lot larger, because I'm going to delete that and bring this here. Okay. Now this is kind of a personal thing that you can play around with on your own, depending on how diffused you want that shadow to look. I think that looks actually pretty good right now, but I could make this a lot larger. If I hold Option, I go from the center, and you know, that might look a little more natural to you. Okay, so that's another way to do a gradient fill that gives it a feeling of dimension, as well as a subtle drop shadow that's using a gradient in the drop shadow, but then setting the blending mode to color burn. Let's take a look at this side. Okay, so what's going on here? In this particular case, we actually have a separate object that has a gradient on it. Okay, And again, when before I start playing around with gradients, I find that it's really easy or much better to identify the, the colors here. All right. In this particular case though, I want to show you how this looks. So in this particular case, both of our shadows are gradients, but they're slightly different gradients, and I'm going to show you why. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill this with the normal gray here. So I'm selecting this, I'm going to use the dropper, I'm going to pick up this normal gray here, and I'm going to set the opacity to normal to start off with. So now we just have a regular gray shape here. Alright, so how do we make this into a gradient? Well, we're going to go ahead and select it, and we have the gradient tool, and we double click on this. Okay, now again, by default it takes the normal fill and makes it go to the dark black here. In this particular case, we actually want that same gray in both sides of our gradient. So I'm going to double click here, and this is where, if I click on the color palette here, I'm actually going to grab this hexadecimal number here. So this is a medium gray 969696. I'm just going to copy that, Command C, and then I'm going to go over to my other swatch on the far right here, double click and Command V and paste. So right now you can see that both sides have that same gray. It's a little bit different from what we did before, where we had the gray and the white. And in this particular case, I'm going to change it so that the opacity for the one on the right here is 0. Okay, and so now you can kind of see what's going on here. We have opacity 100 for that gray on the left side, and we have the same gray, but the opacity is now 0. The opacity here is 100, the opacity here is 0. So same gray, just different opacity. All right, and now we're going to change that from a linear gradient to a radial. Okay, and actually I kind of messed this up, but it's really good for you to see this. Notice, first of all, that the gradient is going from the center out. We want that switched. So a couple ways you could do this, but one way that's really easy is just dragging the different swatches to the other side, and now we have a switch here. Okay, so this is kind of looking a little bit more like what we want. Now you can really start to see this a lot better if we set this to something like color burn, or sorry, I'm going to do multiply here. I'm going to set that to multiply, and you can really start to see, okay, now this shape is starting to give the feeling that we want. But again, we need to go and adjust the actual gradient itself. So if I click on the gradient tool, I'm going to kind of squeeze this down a little bit, get it to kind of the right shape, and then I need to make sure that I grab this white bar so that I can kind of move this up a little bit, and then I'm going to kind of make that bigger. And then again, the same thing, where if you drag one of the swatches for the gradient, it's going to kind of like open it up. All right, so now we only get the shadow down at the bottom there. And so you can see here that this is the same oval, and it's got a gradient fill. Both colors in the gradient are that same gray, but one is set to 0 opacity and the other one is set to 100% opacity. And we've set this to multiply in order to get that feeling, in order for it to look like it's actually darkening. Sorry, we could do darken, or we could do multiply to make it look like it's darkening that element. Alright, and finally, let's talk about this gradient for this shadow. Alright, so again, as usual, I generally start with a shadow here. Let's make sure this is set to opacity normal. Alright, so how would we make this particular shadow? We're going to do the same exact thing, just a little bit different. So we select this object, we're going to double click, and we've got our default gray, but we need to again copy that gray. So we're going to go here and select and copy that gray. Alright, we're copying that gray, and then we're going to the other swatch. We're going to double click into the hex and paste it, Command V, and so now we have that same gray. we're going to switch this to a radial gradient. Okay, right now you can't really see any difference because we haven't changed the opacity on either one. Okay, so let's change that to 0, and now we're starting to get a little bit closer to what we want here. So once again, we need to make sure that our gradient, by clicking on the gradient tool, we need to make sure that that gradient is basically filling the same oval. Okay, carefully holding these handles to stretch this out. All right, and then again, once again, we're going to slide this slider to increase the side that's more opaque, and now we're getting something that looks like this drop shadow here. Now if we select this and we go to opacity, we notice that that's set to multiply. So I'm going to delete this here, click on this, and go to multiply. All right, and now that goes underneath here. And then of course you can play around. I'm dragging the handle here and then holding down Option to keep it centered, and I can play around with kind of like where that gradient is. So those are a couple of more ways to create shading within an object by either using a gradient fill of the same color or filling a separate object with a gradient and then making one element in the gradient or one of the swatches in the gradient 0 opacity. And then for the shadows, this one was a gray to white gradient with a color burn on it, and then this one is a gray to gray gradient with 0 opacity in one of the swatches set to multiply. All right, so I hope that gives you some more options to create interesting and subtle shading within your Adobe Illustrator projects.